If there was one thing which Alexander Hamilton's argument for the Bank of the United States demonstrated, it was that the Constitution, while it was comprehensive, was not designed to anticipate every detail. But the most unforeseen detail of them all, the one in fact that the creators of the Constitution would likely have outlawed if they had foreseen it in 1787, was the formation of political parties. Until the 1790s, American politics was dominated not by the politics of party, but by the politics of faction, or to use some of the other popular terms, junto or caucus. And there were some significant differences between these two categories. Parties differ from factions in that, first of all, faction politics tends to be temporary. It forms around one or two issues and then dissolves with the achievement of one or two political goals. Parties, by contrast, are built around comprehensive, long-term formulas for public policy. Also, faction politics is generally local or regional or special interest oriented. Parties organize constituencies across the nation and across class or ethnic lines. Also, faction politics is small scale. It usually pays little attention to the actual mechanics of obtaining support or recruiting political power. And usually that's because factions are confident that the righteousness of their ideas is all they need, or because they're simply less interested in generating mass support than in influencing the results of one or two decisions. Parties, however, develop large-scale structures for nominations, for mass mobilizations of voters, for propaganda, and for charismatic symbols. Faction politics, to come back to factions again, is also usually personal. It usually revolves around the personality of one or two important leaders, whereas parties offer more democratic structures for participation. More people can enter into the life of a party, and parties survive the loss or the defeat of their leaders. Their leaders might be defeated in an election or in some form of political contest, but the party goes on. A faction might not. All of these characteristics of the modern party system, without exception, stuck about as deeply in the craw of the idea of a republic as the idea of hereditary monarchy itself in the 18th century. The reasons for the 18th century Republican revulsion against parties is not difficult to see because the nature of party politics cuts straight across the grain of what 18th century Whig Republican writers thought of as the three touchstones of true Republican politics. And those three touchstones were liberty, virtue, and commerce. Above all, virtue. Republics, precisely because they were no longer bound together, the way monarchies were, by the potent and corrupt forces of hierarchy, kinship, and patronage, republics were fragile in nature. They didn't have the glue of corruption to hold them together. What they required to survive was a single virtuous mind and a single virtuous political order. Now, parties are the very embodiment of ambition, of selfishness, and the most dreaded of all Republican diseases, corruption. And so Republicans, in the 18th century sense of the term, believed that parties were an example of the past that needed to be put down if a republic was to survive. If I could not go to heaven but with a party, Jefferson remarked, I would not go at all. Nothing could be more ill-judged, agreed Alexander Hamilton in the first of the Federalist Papers, than that intolerant spirit which has at all times characterized political parties. And as James Madison argued in the 10th of the Federalist Papers, the whole purpose of the Constitution had been to prevent the divisions of party interest from corrupting the new republic. this elaborate system of electing a two-house Congress, with each having power to restrain the other's legislation, that whole system was intended to weed out the unvirtuous and the self-interested. As it was put, men of factious tempers or local prejudices or of sinister designs. And instead, the process was intended to put the wisest and the least partisan individuals in control of the nation's destiny. What no one had counted on when the Constitution was written, however, was the seriousness of the split which opened up between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton over policies and programs. And that split, by 1791, was descending from the level of politics and programs to that of ideology. And at that point, matters were beginning to take on the shape not of faction politics, but of national party organization. No one, of course, actually deliberately set out to depart from the official Republican pose of Whig nonpartisanship. The parties which eventually organized around Jefferson and Hamilton denied that they were parties at all, and each claimed that it was simply giving voice to the great, virtuous Republican consensus of the nation, and that it had to organize itself to do so because of what the other side was doing. The other side committed the sin of party organization first. And the other side forced us innocent political bystanders to create a counterparty in order to stamp out the corruption of the aggressors, the other guys. As early as January of 1791, Jefferson was sneering that Hamilton was constructing a sect in the government, which was plainly biased toward monarchy and stock jobbers and king jobbers. So, the only solution was an act of organizational self-defense. The only corrective of what is corrupt in our present trend of government, Jefferson wrote, is the augmentation of the numbers of the lower house so as to get a more agricultural representation, which may put that interest above that of the stock jobbers. It was not Jefferson, however, but Madison, who became the real organizer of what soon was known as the Democratic Republicans, or more simply, the Republicans. Born in 1751, Madison was a lifelong friend of Thomas Jefferson's. And Madison had been one of the principal architects of the federal Constitution at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. In the convention, Madison had allied himself with Hamilton during the debates in the states over the ratification of the Constitution. And he added his voice to Hamilton and John Jay in creating the Federalist Papers in 1788. But as a Virginian, as a slaveholder, and a gentleman farmer like Jefferson, he disagreed strongly with the direction Hamilton was setting in his reports. And from his seat in the House of Representatives, Madison began to orchestrate an organized opposition to Hamilton in both the House and the Senate. By October of 1791, Madison and Jefferson had expanded their congressional organization to include propaganda organs, sponsoring the publication of anti-Hamilton newspapers like the National Gazette and the Philadelphia Aurora, and anti-Hamilton editors like the wild-eyed Philip Freneau and Benjamin Franklin Bache, the grandson of Benjamin Franklin. What Madison accomplished as a Republican organizer in the Capitol, John Beckley, who was the clerk of the House of Representatives, accomplished on the local level. A natural-born political manipulator, Beckley managed local Republican campaigns for office in Pennsylvania, distributed handbills and broadsides, employed express riders to distribute ballots. In other words, he was doing pretty much the same thing as voter registration drives do today. And he used family and kinship networks to get out the vote. By the time that Jefferson left the cabinet at the end of 1793, anti-Hamilton societies were springing up on the local level all across the Republic. 11 clubs known as democratic societies or republican societies were in existence by the end of 1793. And in the next year, another 24 were organized in all but one of the states. Most of this grassroots organizing was based on an appeal to agricultural interests and to suspicious old anti-federalists in the state governments and legislatures who were still, even at this point, largely unreconciled to the Constitution. And in the person of John Taylor of Caroline, the Republicans found an amateur political theorist who was capable of giving the Republicans a comprehensive political ideology that could articulate agricultural grievances in ways that the gangly Thomas Jefferson could not. John Taylor had no use for Hamilton's economics. The only result of Hamilton's policies, warned Taylor, would be a peasantry, wretchedly poor, and an aristocracy luxuriously rich and arrogantly proud. Now, by aristocracy, Taylor meant this legal faction of capitalists, which Hamilton was promoting, an aristocracy of paper and patronage. Now, as for the crime of creating a party, Taylor weighed in against Hamilton in his fat political tract, A Definition of Parties, or the political effect of the paper system considered. And in that, Taylor blamed Hamilton for making party necessary. The people had no other recourse against Hamilton's corruptions except party organization. And now one might as well admit the usefulness of party. The existence of two parties in Congress is apparent, Taylor shrugged. The fact is disclosed almost upon every important question. Hamilton was clearly dismayed at the emergence of an organized party opposition. This is the first symptom of a spirit which must either be killed or it will kill the Constitution, Hamilton complained. In August of 1792, he accused Madison and Jefferson of conspiracy against the administration. Madison for the expectation of popularity, and Jefferson because Mr. Jefferson aims with ardent desire at the presidential chair. The very existence of Philip Freneau's National Gazette as a party newspaper drove Hamilton wild. The whole complexion of his paper is an exact copy of that patronage under which he acts. He is the faithful and devoted servant of the head of a party from whose hand he receives the boon. What drove Hamilton wilder still was Jefferson's campaign to undermine Hamilton's own political base in New York by recruiting two of the most important upstate New York politicians, George Clinton and Aaron Burr, to the Republican cause. So, in short order, Hamilton's rage at Jefferson's party organization turned him toward party organizing of his own. Borrowing the name Federalist from the papers he had written in defense of the Constitution, Hamilton recruited his own cadre of congressional supporters, led by Rufus King of New York in the Senate and Fisher Ames of Massachusetts in the House. Hamilton also used the backing of Washington to manage legislative timetables, conferences and committee appointments, and to raise funds to establish Federalist newspapers, beginning with John Fenno's Gazette of the United States. And to a large extent, Hamilton did succeed in bending Congress to his will. Between 1789 and 1791, twice as many representatives in the House voted to support Hamilton's initiatives as those against. But Hamilton did little of the grassroots organizing that the Republicans had done with their clubs and societies. Hamilton still had difficulty freeing himself from the notion that in a republic, politics should be nonpartisan, should be virtuous and disinterested. And so the only effective organization the Federalists really enjoyed was the one they managed to create inside Congress itself. Most of the popular support the Federalists enjoyed was either based in the great seaports of New England, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston, or else it was wrapped up in the national veneration for the figure of President Washington. Now, take it all together, and this does not look like a very well-spread or well-organized base of political support. And as events would prove, it wasn't. But in 1795, the prestige of George Washington was worth the president's weight in gold. And what was more, the Jeffersonian Republicans nearly destroyed themselves at the beginning by a catastrophic failure of political judgment. 10 weeks after Washington's inauguration as the first president in New York City, the starving mobs in the streets of Paris rose up and destroyed the Bastille, a one-time prison and part-time arsenal in a working-class district of Paris. The fall of the Bastille became the emotional symbol of the French Revolution. And the old French monarchy was replaced 3 days later by a constitutional monarchy and a new liberal constitution. Jefferson, who had been serving out the end of a spell as American ambassador to France when this revolt erupted, took up his duties as Washington's Secretary of State almost delirious with joy over the French situation. France, who had been America's oldest ally, America's help during the Revolution, had now joined America in revolution. And perhaps France would join the United States as a sister republic. It would be the coming thing. It would be the leading edge, France and America together, changing the world, bringing down monarchy and unfair and born privilege. Hamilton likewise wrote that the news of the French Revolution filled him with the same passions he had felt in 1775. But by 1792, it was a different story. The French Revolution, unlike the American, had rapidly turned from an experiment in republican liberty and virtue into a bloody vendetta against the French monarchy, marked in 1793 by the emergence of Maximilien Robespierre and the imposition of Robespierre's reign of terror. Thousands of enemies of the revolution were paraded to the guillotine. Christianity was to be replaced by a religion of reason. When a republic was officially proclaimed in France in September of 1793, Hamilton snorted at it as an insult to the name of republic. When the French went to war against Britain and the other European monarchies, Hamilton urged Washington not to allow the United States to be dragged into collaboration with the French. These urgings were lost on Thomas Jefferson and his Republicans, who preferred to overlook the excesses of the French Republic on the grounds that a revolution in favor of liberty requires the breaking of a few royal heads. But with every fresh sensation from France, Jefferson's tenacious faith in the French Revolution embarrassed his Republicans more and more. The first envoy of the French Republic, Edmond Genet, outraged Washington by commissioning American ships to attack British merchant vessels. Now, think of the consequences of this. If American merchant vessels receive a commission from an agent of the French Republic to go out and privateer on the high seas and capture British ships and then destroy them or seize them as prizes, who will be blamed for that? France? Perhaps, but remember, those are American ships. Will not the British government then also put the blame at the door of the United States? Will that not lead to a renewal of war when war is the last thing the United States needs to contemplate right now? Even Jefferson finally admitted that Citizen Genet and his bloodthirsty government would sink the Republican interest if they do not abandon him. and he was not far from wrong, feeling against Genet erupted in Richmond and in New York City and in New Jersey and Maryland and Delaware, and Washington eventually angrily demanded that the French Republic revoke Genet's credentials. And yet, even with the advantages the Federalists enjoyed in Hamilton's leadership, in Washington's support, in their control of Congress, in their wealthy and upwardly mobile urban support, and in the folly of Jefferson's association with the French, what is simply amazing is how the Federalists so quickly fumbled all these advantages away. Hamilton's skill in formulating public policy did not always translate well into making policy work. For instance, Hamilton's determination to fund the nation's Revolutionary War debt led to those tariffs on imports that I described earlier, and also that steep excise tax on whiskey. Now, Hamilton may have looked at whiskey production as a luxury. All right, we'll tax that, and no one should really get terribly embarrassed about it. But on the agricultural frontier, whiskey was an efficient and profitable way to produce a useful commodity out of surplus grain. Grain, after all, will not keep. It does not have a long shelf life, so to speak. However, when you take grain and distill it down into whiskey, there is something which can stay on the shelf for a long time, and what's more, be easily brought to market and traded for other goods. To tax whiskey, then, was to lay a heavy burden on the back of farmers who turned their excess grain into whiskey. So in the summer of 1794, farmers in western Pennsylvania and in North Carolina fought back by the methods that they had perfected all too well during the Revolution. Mobs, intimidation of tax collectors, a convention in Pittsburgh, and, sure enough, committees of correspondence. Hamilton and Washington immediately interpreted the disturbances as a test of the federal government's authority, an all-or-nothing crisis in which it must be determined whether the government can maintain itself. Secretary of War Knox sounded the alarm for 12,000 militiamen to assemble at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And at the end of September, Hamilton and Washington donned uniforms and took personal command of these forces and marched westward to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion. The result was a fiasco. The whiskey tax resistors had no army. They simply melted away back to their farms, and who could tell who was who? Hamilton longed to hang someone as an example. He tried to hang Hugh Henry Brackenridge, a journalist in Pittsburgh, when he discovered that Brackenridge had failed to properly sign his oath of submission to the excise law. But in the end, the whole dramatic scene had to be called off, and Hamilton and Washington returned to Philadelphia looking considerably the sillier. The Whiskey Rebellion turned out to be only the beginning of the Federalists' sorrows. In 1795, Washington sent John Jay to Britain to negotiate a commercial treaty which would settle a number of loose ends left over from the end of the Revolutionary War. In these negotiations, the British could afford to deal from strength. And the treaty that Jay came back to the United States with was so lopsided in the privileges given to British merchants that it nearly failed to get Senate approval. The Jay Treaty certainly did not get popular approval. Jay remarked that he could have traveled from Boston to Philadelphia by night with the light thrown from burning effigies of himself dangling along the road. Then in 1795, the Federalist leadership began to disintegrate. Hamilton left the cabinet, physically exhausted and also needing to return to his lucrative law practice in New York in order to recoup the income he'd lost while serving the public. Then in the summer of 1796, Washington announced that he would not seek a third term as president. That announcement at once deprived the Federalists of their most potent political figurehead. Benjamin Franklin Bache's Aurora trumpeted happily that the name of Washington from this day ceases to give currency to political iniquity. The Republicans in Congress immediately agreed to nominate Thomas Jefferson for the presidency, with the New Yorker, Aaron Burr, as his vice presidential choice. The Federalists, by contrast, were paralyzed. The most obvious Federalist nominee was Washington's vice president, John Adams. But Hamilton suspected Adams, and rightly, of being less than an enthusiastic supporter of Hamilton's own Federalist agenda, and Hamilton urged that Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina be nominated instead. Well, in the end, the Federalists compromised by running Adams for the presidency and Pinckney as his vice president. And as it turned out, they compromised just in time. The voting at the end of 1796 gave Adams the presidency, but only barely. The Constitution did not provide for the direct election of the president by the people of the United States. Remember from the last lecture that because of their mistrust of the passions of the common herd, the authors of the Constitution had instead made eligible white male voters in the states vote for slates of electors pledged to the various presidential candidates, who would then, in turn, meet and cast their electoral votes in the Electoral College, so that the president was elected really not by a majority of the people, but by a majority of the electors. Well, to make this process even more complicated, the Constitution had made no provision for pairing the president and vice president in the election process as we do today. Today, when we think of people running for high office, we think of a ticket of president and vice president who are running together as a single unit. Well, that did not obtain under the Constitution originally. The framers of the Constitution, who of course had never anticipated the emergence of political parties, had simply assumed that out of any group of likely and virtuous candidates for the presidency, the top vote getters would be the president and the runner-up would be the vice president. Of course, by 1796, both Federalists and Republicans had taken on a political life of their own and nominated their own choices for both president and vice president. But the winner-take-all process, which the Constitution provided, allowed for no distinction between a Federalist candidate for president and a Republican nominee for vice president. The result was, then, that it was perfectly possible for the candidate of one party to garner the majority of votes and become president, while the runner-up might be the opposing party's candidate for president, thus saddling the president not with a vice president of his own choosing, but with his erstwhile rival. And this, of course, is precisely what happened in the election of 1796. Adams squeaked into the presidency with a total of 71 electoral votes. But his proposed vice presidential candidate, Pinckney, picked up only 59. Thomas Jefferson, meanwhile, garnered 68 electoral votes, and by the law of the land, Thomas Jefferson thereby became John Adams's vice president. Jefferson also became a giant-sized cuckoo in the Federalists' political nest. For while Jefferson's powers as vice president would not be great, still the Constitution mandated that Jefferson would serve as the presiding officer of the Senate. And there was no doubt in anyone's mind but that he would use that position to frustrate every Federalist legislative initiative which appeared there.